Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webcast, and we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Okay, well, welcome everyone to today's webinar, Migrate Your Data Warehouse to Amazon Redshift. My name is Greg Coralla, and I lead the business development team for database and analytics here at AWS. As we jump into it, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what a traditional data warehouse looked like. You know, traditionally these were on-premise relational databases that had a lot of useful integrations in terms of enterprise resource planning data, CRM data, OLTP or online transaction processing data, where we would transform it and then load it into a data warehouse and put some kind of business intelligence or reporting tool on top of it. And if you think about the profile of an on-premise data warehouse, oftentimes I had to put a large capital investment up front. So it could be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, to essentially establish the architecture to get insights out of my data. And the data tend to fit into relational structures, meaning that I had to define a schema, then transform and load the data from the source systems. And it made it a little bit difficult in terms of how I was able to scale and essentially provide the insights to the data analysts. And so if a new data source came in that a business wanted to report off of, oftentimes I'd have to take weeks to months in order to get that source integrated with my existing schema. And what we've seen, in the past number of years is the cost, complexity, and lack of insights in a traditional on-premise data warehouse have really hindered the growth and insights the business can provide. And not just in terms of cost, but also just the type of data that the business needs to get access to make better decisions. And so if we think about the traditional structured data, it's oftentimes a small fraction of the data that's available for analysis. Particularly if we think about weblogs and social media, sentiment analysis, all the rich types of data that's generated by modern systems today, oftentimes that becomes very difficult to load into a traditional relational data warehouse. And so we think about this idea of dark data, meaning that there's data that is available for analysis, but because of the size or complexity or cost, it just didn't make sense to load into a traditional on-premise data warehouse. But this data does have value, and this idea that we want to provide a system where I can analyze all my data and be able to make decisions based upon not just traditional sources, but a full set of sources is really where a lot of the trends in the past number of years have been leading. And so not only there's a few points, but not just the dark data or the ability to access that, but questions we oftentimes get is, is the cost of running your data warehouse draining your IT budget? So we called out earlier the, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of investment where I had to, bring some kind of on-premise appliance and load it and power it and cool it, and then be able to, load data into it. Oftentimes, becomes a drawback in terms of getting data and answers out. So cost is definitely, a big driver for why customers are looking at a cloud data warehouse. But then the second one is really around performance. And so, depending upon the age of my hardware or when I purchased the on-premise data warehouse, oftentimes, I'm on older technology. I'm not able to scale to the scope that my systems require in terms of compute and storage. And so, if I'm limited by the performance of the data warehouse, where business analysts say, hey, it's taking minutes or longer to get answers when they want to be able to make decisions in near real time. And then thinking about the scale of my on-premise data warehouse. So, perhaps a year ago, I might have sized my compute and storage for a particular capacity, but now, I'm at the limit of that. And I have to think about what's the capacity that I need, a year from now or 2 years from now, and having to do this planning, as opposed to a system like Amazon Redshift, where I can simply, use the capacity that's currently needed, and then simply add more as needed at any time. And then the last point is around getting access to the right data at the right users. So, we talked about, unlocking the dark data and being able to give analysts access to all the data that's available to make the best decisions becomes a key consideration. And so thinking about Amazon Redshift, so Amazon Redshift is a cloud native relational data warehouse that provides massive parallel processing in a columnar database. And we'll provide a little bit of definitions of what those are. But beyond just the definition, I think it's important to know that Amazon Redshift has by far the largest number of data warehouses deployed in the cloud. And it's used by small startups, customers that are born in the cloud, as well as Fortune 100 across a number of different industries and geographies. And here's a few logos of some of the most visible customers that are using it, and we'll provide a few case studies at the end of this presentation to go into a little bit more detail. And then not only have customers been adopting it, given by the public case studies that we have and the logos we saw earlier, but there's been a lot of third-party analysts that have looked at this cloud data warehouse space and actually have provide ranking. And so to the extent you provide value from analysts such as Gartner, you can see in their latest data quadrant or Magic Quadrant for data management solutions, the favorable position that Amazon Redshift has compared to other players. And I would call out that Redshift has been on the market for about 5 years, and we're really proud, to be able to deliver value to customers, and the validation by third parties that show it, in favorable comparison to not only the legacy data warehouse vendors, but also many of the newer players in the marketplace, which really just speaks to the adoption and value that customers are seeing from Amazon Redshift for a cloud native data warehouse. And the second kind of third-party validation I would go through is just from 2017, the Forrester Wave, where Forrester called out that Redshift has the largest adoption of any data warehouse in the cloud. And Forrester estimates over 5,000 customers globally have actually deployed in production on Redshift, and really give AWS and Amazon Redshift a high score for its customer base, market awareness, and ability to execute. And this is on the extent that third-party validations make sense, and there's full reports that are available on the Amazon Redshift webpage for you to download and to evaluate as well. So kind of a customer adoption, validation by third parties all speak to the value that customers are getting by looking at Redshift, their data warehouse. And I just wanted to provide a quick summary of some of the key reasons why customers have been adopting Amazon Redshift over the past 5 years. And oftentimes the first point comes down to this performance. And so the ability to unlock the dark data we talked about earlier, but still have fast SQL-based results that's integrated with business intelligence tools like Tableau and MicroStrategy and Amazon QuickSight for that visualization. But just the fact that we're able to separate compute and storage, we're able to provide great insights to the data and really provide that speed of analysis oftentimes becomes a key point for adopting Amazon Redshift. And the second one around simplicity. And so, thinking back to one of our first slides in terms of an on-premise data warehouse, just think about having to install, configure, maintain the hardware, provide power, cooling, coming up with a backup strategy, a disaster recovery strategy. And all those things are essentially features of Amazon Redshift. And so we make it really simple to get started, but then allow you to adapt the system as your needs change as well. And so the fact that I can simply get started and some of the tasks such as backing up and being able to provide disaster recovery or high availability are just features that you can take advantage of with the Amazon Redshift platform. And next, in terms of the cost, the fact that there are no upfront costs, you can simply get started for as little as less than $1 per hour, and then just pay as you go for the capacity you currently need. And so there's no long-term software contracts with Amazon Redshift. If you have one project that you just want to test out, for perhaps tens if not $20, you can simply get going and test it out and be able to take advantage of our free tier if you're new to Amazon Redshift to simply test out the platform. And then once you're ready to make a commitment to Amazon Redshift, if it makes sense for your use case, you continue to operate in the on-demand model where I'm just simply paying by the hour, or you could take advantage of some of the pricing discounts for commitments in terms of 1 or 3 year reserved instance to get up to 70% discount off the on-demand rate. And so the cost effectiveness of Redshift, particularly compared to on-premise systems, oftentimes becomes a deciding factor to look and consider Redshift for your data warehouse. The next, in terms of scalability, so in terms of being able to start out and testing Redshift with just a few gigabytes of data, but then knowing that as my data expands or as I migrate from my legacy on-premise systems, whether it's gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, even exabytes of data, Amazon Redshift can seamlessly scale. And you just have to pay for the amount of compute and storage that you currently need and not have to pre-commit in terms of licenses or hardware and software, and simply be able to scale as needed across all your different lines of businesses. And then I think an important part is that Amazon Redshift doesn't just sit in a vacuum within AWS ecosystem, that it's tightly integrated with building a data lake on AWS in terms of other AWS services like Amazon Glue and Athena and QuickSight to be able to provide that full end-to-end compatibility across the full AWS ecosystem. And then integration with third-party tools. So if you have investments in Tableau or Informatica, for instance, we have close partnerships with both of those, as well as many other software vendors, to be able to provide that fully integrated experience with Amazon Redshift. And then in terms of security, which of course is mission one for us across all of AWS services, knowing that we have full ability to audit everything that users and administrators do and encrypt the data with a flexible set of encryption options and certification and compliance such as HIPAA and FedRAMP and PCI, so that you can store your most sensitive data and make sure that Amazon Redshift can provide all the needs across many different industries, becomes an important consideration point as well. And now I talked a little bit about querying all of your data. And I just wanted to this isn't really meant as a technical deep dive into Amazon Redshift, but just wanted to provide a little bit of insights into what we really mean and why we think with Amazon Redshift is a little bit different than other options you might see on-premise or in the cloud. Now, of course, the Redshift query engine provides a fully ANSI SQL compliant ODBC and JDBC interface that common BI tools can connect to. And Redshift does have a native file format where I can simply insert, update, and delete as any kind of relational database. And this is really where the columnar MPP or massively parallel processing part of Amazon Redshift comes into play. But more and more we find that there's a set of data that isn't necessarily structured, that comes in these Apache formats like Parquet, ORC, and Avro, or JSON, or simply CSV files, but where, yes, I can, still follow the pattern of transforming and loading it into Amazon Redshift, But in some cases, either because of the cost or complexity of the data sets, the fact that I want to share the data, I don't have to necessarily load it into the Redshift native file format. I can keep it in its open format. And by open, I mean the Apache formats like Parquet and ORC and Avro or JSON or even CSV, and simply create a view of that data called an external table in Amazon Redshift and query the data directly on S3 by taking advantage of separating compute and storage. And so there's a feature in Redshift called Spectrum that is a serverless query engine that is seamless to the Redshift user. So the business intelligence analyst still connects to the ODBC or JDBC endpoint of Redshift, but now can see a set of tables where the data is not local to Redshift, but the data actually sits on S3, and it sits on these open file formats and query it directly. And this really skips a big part of many data warehouse projects, which is the extraction, transforming, and loading it into the database. You can simply query it directly and immediately on S3. And so understanding the power that the Spectrum feature of Redshift brings to extend your data warehouse to the data lake and to query S3 directly, and simply, being able to have a cost model where I only pay by query for the amount of data scanned. I don't have to pick small, medium, or large type clusters, but can simply query it directly regardless of the data size, becomes an important factor to integrate the data lake with our data warehouse. And so beyond just the ability to query the data lake on S3, I called out a little bit earlier that Redshift is integrated with many business intelligence tools. And I would call this out in regards to today's topic, which is migrating to Amazon Redshift, that many times the customers I deal with will say, we're going to keep our business intelligence tool, whether it's Tableau or MicroStrategy or any of the other vendors listed on the slide, much a larger list that's probably not listed, but kind of keep that end user interaction constant, where the reports and dashboards that the business users have been using for the most part will stay the same, but now I can re-platform to Amazon Redshift and be able to provide a much faster and lower cost experience for those users. And so the fact that we have a number of specific certifications with a large set of BI tools, plus the ODBC and JDBC connectivity, really provides that stability so that as we are migrating to Redshift, I can keep the end user interaction, and then perhaps as phase 2, look to right-size my BI reporting systems and really provide that phased approach to the migration. Becomes a very popular pattern with customers that are looking to migrate to Amazon Redshift. And how do I get started? Well, we really want to make it easy. And again, today's topic is around focusing on the migration piece. And so the part that I oftentimes spend with customers is understanding, great, like we know Amazon Redshift, its features and why it might be a benefit to our business. Maybe we've done a proof of concept and we've tried it out and it makes sense, but now how do we actually start the migration? And if you're interested in more of the details of Amazon Redshift, there are deeper dives in terms of the technology and how I take advantage of it, but we really want to talk about how do I get started with the migration. And I think, foundational to that is really understanding the core components of AWS, and components such as Direct Connect, which is the networking component, or VPN, right? And so understanding how I'm able to create a virtual private cloud, or VPC, and have the right connectivity between, my data center and where the AWS region is, where Redshift is running, really become foundational elements to that. And again, could be a topic of a separate webinar, but hoping that everyone on the call today understands some of the core concepts like virtual private cloud and Direct Connect where needed. But then in terms of the ability to get data in, we see AWS Snowball, which is a device that we can mail to your location that has a various size of data that I can simply use, the US mail essentially, or UPS to send data between your data center. And so Snowball becomes a very effective way to get that mass data from my on-premise data warehouse into AWS. But then we'll spend some time looking at the database migration service, which allows me to do not only one-time migration from relational databases on-premise to Redshift, but also change data capture and being able to keep up to date the data warehouse between two different locations. And of course, if I'm using Amazon Kinesis, I could take advantage of Kinesis Firehose to simply have Redshift or S3 as a default location to be able to land that stream data by taking advantage of the Kinesis Firehose capabilities to be able to take that streaming data into Redshift itself. Now, when we think about migrations, and I think this oftentimes, sometimes I hear, hey, migration really equals cost and complexity and takes a long time, right? And I think the idea of replatforming your data warehouse has been around for probably decades. And what's really different, or what makes some of the capabilities of AWS unique in terms of being able to take advantage of the Redshift platform. And if you know some of these things, if you've done database replatforming in the past, hopefully some of these things have been are familiar in terms of challenges that we want to be able to address. So making sure we can do it in a timely manner and not have to take application downtime. So we want to kind of overcome these challenges by looking at adopting Amazon Redshift as my platform. And so how do we actually address those challenges we'd listed in the previous slide? Well, we do offer automated tools, right, that can help ease the migration, but then more importantly, a set of certified solution integrator partners that really have the expertise in terms of not just replatforming, but then how do I optimize my entire analytics stack to take advantage of the features in the cloud. And so I think what the automated tools are really great at is provide that quick start or that jump start to really get your data into Redshift. But oftentimes, moving the data is probably one of the easier tasks. But then really, how do I think about the way decision making is going to benefit in the modern cloud environment is really one of the great things that our system integrator partners that will be spending some time to walk through some examples with you and really provide that partnership where help is needed. And in terms of the popularity of the number of customers that have been taking advantage of this, we estimate over 80,000 unique databases have already been migrated to AWS using the tool set that we'll be covering here shortly. And so in terms of the actual automated migration tools, there's really two different components that I'll spend a little bit of time on. The first is the AWS database migration service that allows you to easily and securely migrate the data. And that's not just about migrating it, but then also replicating between whether your databases on EC2, on RDS, or even on-premise, and being able to replicate and migrate data into Amazon Redshift and then keep them updated after the initial migration becomes an important key feature of database migration service. And then I'll cover a little bit about schema conversion tool that then helps move not just the data, but the actual database objects and tables and schemas to Redshift as well. And so on database migration service, again, we could debate maybe it should be better named the database replication service, but it does the one-time migration of data plus the ability to keep the databases in sync in terms of being able to do change data capture where available for different database sources into Redshift. And so I think the power and flexibility is that whether I have a relational database such as Oracle or SQL Server or MySQL, and being able to set up that replication using DMS into Redshift, but also non-relational databases. And so the AWS database migration services supports MongoDB, for instance, to have that non-relational database. But then one of the most powerful components becomes the ability for DMS to use S3 as a source and a target. And so, if for whatever reason my database listed is not listed here, as long as I can get the data into Amazon S3, I can use DMS as an easy way to pick up the data from S3 into Redshift. And there's a large, ecosystem of third-party partner tools that basically provide data integrations. And I think not only will you find that many of those third-party tools provide Amazon Redshift as a target, but almost universally, at least in my experience, I find that S3 will certainly be a target for many of these tools as well. And so my first advice oftentimes becomes get your data into S3. And from S3, you can choose, the right method to get the data into Redshift from there. But, moving the data oftentimes becomes, one of the easier tasks. Certainly there is a lot of the size and how changes are updated across those discussions to have. But, oftentimes, particularly if I have a system like Oracle or Teradata where, I've optimized my schema, my data types, my stored procedures, my application logic. And so, being able to have the AWS schema conversion tool do an assessment of my data warehouse and then provide that mapping into Amazon Redshift. And the schema conversion tool can be a little, it can be easy to use, but at the same time, there can be results where, I need to be able to do some analysis, such as if I have, features in my, source system that aren't supported in Redshift, then, we'll work with you to figure out a way to work around that component. And so the schema conversion tool is not meant to necessarily be a push button magic tool to move into Redshift, but really provides that ability to extract data and then convert the objects where the equivalent object exists in Redshift, and then provide the ability to flag areas that cannot move into Redshift or perhaps need some help with our system integrator or partner consultants to be able to help rework the application for the modern cloud era. And I think that this particularly, I think, raises a question around stored procedures. And so those of you who understand Amazon Redshift know that today we do not have stored procedures in Redshift, but oftentimes they're heavily utilized in legacy on-premise systems. And the schema conversion tool will provide an assessment of those, and where possible, we will convert the stored procedures into user-defined functions that Redshift supports. But oftentimes, our recommendation would be, let's relook a way to think about that application logic in the stored procedure. I spent myself many years in the data warehouse industry, and one of the trends that I've seen the past few years with Redshift and other cloud data warehouses is to abstract the proprietary scripting language in any one database and have that the similar process, but have that run outside the database in an open language like Python, for instance, or Java, such that it provides that application logic that's not tied to a particular execution engine. And so kind of just understanding some of those best practices is something that our system integrator partners can really benefit from. And the AWS schema conversion tool can provide recommendations on the type of objects that are a little bit more difficult to move. But then, beyond that, part, the other benefit is that, if I do have, whether 10 terabytes or hundreds of terabytes of data in a system like Teradata or Oracle, in these two examples, I can not only, use the schema conversion tool to create my table schemas in Amazon Redshift, but I can actually extract the data. And so if for some reason, based on the size or complexity of the data, the database migration service doesn't work, but I want to, unload, hundreds of terabytes or tens of terabytes of data, and then take advantage of, Amazon Snowball to be able to move the data in bulk to S3, knowing that I can set up a number of extractors that simply provide the migration agents to unload the data becomes an important feature. And so I can run the extractors. You can run one or multiple of them to parallelize the unload, and then save them into local files, and then use things like Snowball or simply copying the data into S3 to really, take advantage of AWS services to help with that migration as well. And then, some of the key reasons of why to use database migration service in conjunction with schema conversion tool. Well, really, we want to help, remove the barriers to entry. And by this, I mean, how do I, easily test if Amazon Redshift makes sense for my use case if I have one of those legacy on-premise data warehouses. And so, simply setting up database migration service as a source and Redshift as a target can provide that jumpstart to really, get data into Redshift and start being able to take advantage of the features that Redshift can provide. And not only that, but then, one of the challenges I called out in terms of, traditional database replatforming is the idea of downtime. But with database migration service, for the sources it supports, I can do this near zero downtime migration, meaning that, there's a certain way I can get the bulk data moved into S3 into Redshift, but then I can actually keep the changes up to date. So maybe for a period of time, I'm still having my ETL tool run against my legacy system, and then leverage the database migration service to synchronize data between the two systems while I do my testing, and then at some point I can cut over to Redshift if needed, or keep both of them running as well is a common pattern, and really use Redshift for new projects. But thinking about that near zero downtime with database migration service to be able to keep those sources in sync becomes a great assurance while I'm testing out and early in my adoption of Amazon Redshift. Then of course, security in terms of making sure the data is encrypted and that I have, full security controls regardless of my industry becomes a key component of looking at DMS as well. And it's great that DMS is and schema conversion tool. I would say they're fairly easy to use. Like any kind of option, I would want to just recommend looking at the documentation and doing some tests. But it's actually really easy to get started with DMS. But as I get more knowledge and comfort into DMS, it becomes some options, more sophisticated options. For instance, I called out in schema conversion tool, I can have multiple extractors run to really parallelize getting the data out of that legacy on-premise system. Another example would be, if I have, maybe a heterogeneous where I have Oracle and Teradata, maybe SQL Server, I can essentially have, those database migration service jobs running against all three of those, and then combine it into a single Redshift schema. Or if I have just a subset of tables in Oracle, for example, I can just choose to pull over certain tables or subset of those tables into Redshift. And so there's a lot of advanced features that DMS can provide beyond just the simplicity of getting started. And really what I think, what oftentimes we hear customers talk about is allowing this database freedom. And by this, I mean, when I think about moving to Amazon Redshift, it's not just about moving from one proprietary database to another, but it's really unlocking the value of all of our data, particularly where I think about, the data on S3 in these open file formats that provides a flexible set of query tools against that database, against that data on S3, really allows, not just database freedom, but really unlocking the data for a wide variety of use cases. And then, in terms of hybrid architectures, which oftentimes I get a lot of questions around, the fact that I can use database migration service to synchronize data between on-premise or AWS really provides that ability to get started and not, take advantage if I have existing investments in my on-premise data warehouse, not just have to move all or nothing. And so that really provides a nice way to have a hybrid architecture as well. And the pricing, we're not going to, don't just go into details on the database migration service pricing, but it's really cost effective to get started. And it's a great way to kind of synchronize my data and test out how not only how Redshift can work, but also run it into production to keep those systems in sync. And so here's just a few things around different partners that are available. And so I called out earlier in the middle the fact that Amazon Redshift and Amazon S3 support a wide variety of business intelligence partners. And so almost certainly I can choose to keep my existing BI reports and dashboards. The schemas mostly will map directly into Redshift as well. And that really provides that stability for the migration so that the business users or end users oftentimes don't have to change their reports. Now, in some cases, we might want to look at the reports that are being generated and see if they still make sense as part of the process. So, the customers I work with, oftentimes will take the first approach of maintaining the reports and dashboards as is for the most part, and look at optimizing the reporting as phase 2. But in many cases, if I have, existing business logic in a proprietary database SQL format, I might need to relook some of those reports, particularly, if they're, 5 or 10 years old. So we want to provide, some best practices in terms of, being able to get the most out of the reporting layer. And then, also from the data integration side. And so, if I have, investments, let's say in Informatica, for instance, Informatica has been, a top partner of AWS that supports not only Amazon Redshift, but also Amazon S3 as a source. But there's lots of options today where if you're looking to modernize your ETL processing, being able to take advantage of tools like Talend or Matillion or Pentaho and SnapLogic, kind of on down the list of options. And so we really provide the freedom to choose the right data integration and BI tool that makes the most sense for your particular project. And then in terms of help from system integrators, I think one of the strengths of AWS ecosystem as well as Amazon Redshift is just the strength and options to be able to get certified partners that understand AWS and our big data ecosystem for help in terms of consulting to be able to provide specific knowledge. And then beyond just our big data certification, we actually have a migration certification as well. And so, looking at options with 47 lining, CloudReach, CloudWick, Tensor IoT, and Relic Cloud really provide that migration certification to help you get started on your journey and being able to take advantage of many of the features that Redshift can provide. And so I just had a couple of examples of customers that have migrated. and some links to additional information. So I just provided a quick summary, but the first one I would call out is Equinox Fitness. And so Equinox presented with me at the Chicago Summit back last month, and I provided a link to the full session on YouTube. And I think if you don't know Equinox, right, they provide not only the Equinox Fitness clubs, but many other brands like Blink and Pure Yoga and Soul Cycle and others. And they also operate a large hotel chain, and they have 200 locations in almost every city across the US, including expansions into London and Canada. And Equinox migrated from a legacy data warehouse on-premise to Amazon Redshift. And some of the key highlights that I pulled out of their presentation with the full video link here at the bottom is that they started off by moving 2 applications in less than 4 months off the legacy system into Redshift, and they completely re-platformed off of their on-premise data warehouse in less than a year. And some of the benefits they had, of course, was being able to take advantage of automated regression testing to make sure that reports exactly matched up between the old system and the new one. But then, in their case, they called out, they moved off of a Teradata platform. And, the quote I loved from this presentation was that the annual cost of Amazon Redshift is actually significantly less than their annual maintenance cost was previously with Teradata. And so for more details, I did provide, the link here to kind of go through a full hour presentation on Equinox, but it's a great, example of a customer that's actually made the move. And the second one I wanted to highlight, and again, I provided the full link to the article that was recently published around McDonald's and really around the digital transformation. And so McDonald's looked at, and I think the article does a great job of some of the decision points that they made in terms of looking at a few options of on-premise, running a data warehouse on Amazon EC2, or looking at AWS native services. And McDonald's actually chose, and it's called out in this article, to migrate to Redshift, and not only moving tens if not hundreds of terabytes of data, but actually redoing their ETL jobs and taking advantage of the power that Talend brings from ETL source. And so over 1,300 ETL jobs were re-platformed to Talend as part of their digital transformation to AWS as well. And I would encourage everyone, we'll provide the links to the slide to read the full details in the CIO Dive news article that's referenced in this slide. And so how do I get started? Well, to find out more, oftentimes I say, you can go to aws.amazon.com/redshift. But importantly, I would say, to start a proof of concept or just to try it, right? And oftentimes I get asked to fill out, RFPs or requests for proposals and answer written questions, which, we're happy to do. But at the same time, we would say, just launch a cluster, load some data, and see what your results are, right? And if you need help, if you're running a proof of concept and if things aren't, performing as needed, or you just have some questions, we actually provide a link both on this slide as well as on our webpage to simply reach out to one of our experts on Amazon Redshift to kind of help you with the proof of concept. And one of the great things is whether it's from our internal AWS team, our consulting partners, or ISV partners, but more importantly, customers, that we have a rich set of blog articles that go into details around specific topics like performance tuning or migration lessons learned, or hearing directly from customers, not only at conferences like AWS Summits or reInvent, but actually webinars and how they blog about their architectures. And so I would encourage everyone, if you're looking to see who else and some of the best practices, to keep a track of the blog articles that are linked here that are available on the aws.amazon.com/redshift webpage as well. And finally, I know it's quick. We'll answer, let someone have a little time for questions, but thank you for joining the webinar. And really, we wanted to just give this as a kickstarted way to understand some next steps in terms of getting started and how I can leverage Amazon Redshift with things like being able to use database migration service and schema conversion tool. So I've got a few minutes for questions. I was just going to read a few off that were in the chat window here. So there was a question from Paul about if there's a connector for Power BI. So yes, Paul, believe it or not, Power BI does have a connector to Amazon Redshift. I believe it's in the drop-down box, so that should be available. But then also you can use the ODBC connector as well. But the last time I checked, Power BI was a supported, Amazon Redshift was a supported data source for Power BI. And then Paul had a second question. Out of scope, do you have a comparison between data pipeline versus Glue for ETL into Redshift? So it's a question we get a lot around, data pipeline and Glue. I would say that the understanding what Glue is, I think, is an important consideration when we think about ETL. So Glue provides, two capabilities. The first is the AWS Glue data catalog that provides that metadata layer between data on S3 and tables and columns and rows that systems like Redshift and Athena can query, right? And so understanding the data catalog component of Glue, I think, is important. But then from an ETL or transformation perspective, Glue provides that serverless Spark container where if you have a set of users internally that prefer to write Python or Scala as the scripting language for my transformation, and simply run a Spark container to execute that, Glue provides that serverless Spark container to actually manage the ETL process for you. And so that really provides a great way from an ease of use perspective to leverage Python and Scala for my transformations. And so kind of it's a quick summary, but there's more information on AWS at amazon.com/glue. But then how that compares to data pipeline. And so data pipeline is really great at orchestration, where I can invoke a number of different tasks, but generally, Glue kind of understanding the data pipeline, understanding the data catalog and the serverless Spark container are really what the strengths of Glue are. And we continue to invest in AWS Glue as really the strategic platform for AWS going forward. And so now there's a question about, can you please provide some insights into replication instance in DMS? So that, I guess, I'm not sure if the question is completely clear to me, but so thinking about DMS, right? It has, first of all, the supported data sources being Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, MariaDB, Sybase. I believe I covered all of them. And then, when I set up my replication, I can choose, some for testing and maybe one of the T2 instances, for instance, but almost certainly for the production migration, I might choose something like an R3 and R4. Because I wasn't sure if by replication instance you were referring to the EC2 instance type, but you can have a variety of EC2 instance types. And obviously, the more compute, the more storage, the more memory, depending upon the bandwidth of data, we would see, better performance for the actual migration. So I think that's, hopefully, I think there was a follow-up question. I can see if I can answer. I'm going to migrate from Postgres to Redshift, but SET does not support. How do I achieve this? Okay, that's a little bit clearer. So remember that hopefully I didn't make this too confusing, but there's the database migration service, and then there's schema conversion tool, right? And so with, particularly if you're on Postgres and the fact that, Redshift provides, an endpoint that is also appears to be iTools as Postgres, I don't think that there's much schema conversion between Postgres and Redshift required, unless you're using one of the data types that Redshift doesn't support. And so I think what I oftentimes see, particularly with customers going from Postgres to Redshift, is simply use the database migration service to synchronize the data between both those sources, and not having to worry so much about the schema conversion tool, because without knowing the specifics of your database, I would assume that majority, if not all, of the objects in Postgres would migrate directly to Redshift. And if there's any questions, Anchor, if you have a moment or a pen to write down my email, it's Greg, G-R-E-G-K-H, at amazon.com, and happy to kind of address your question offline as well. And so there's a question of, can scans from Redshift S3 be prepaid for unlimited flat rate instead of pay per amount of scans? Right, so thanks, Michael, on that question. So just to recap, Redshift has a feature called Spectrum. Spectrum has a pay by query model where I don't have to predefine the amount of compute needed, but we determine that at runtime to query open file formats directly on S3. And so in terms of, there is no like unlimited flat scan rate per se, but I would, call out, Michael, that if you're familiar with, in Redshift, we have something called query monitoring rules. And what query monitoring rules can provide are controls in terms of CPU, IO, or data scanned that also can apply to Spectrum. And so understanding the query monitoring rules component within Redshift, and therefore Spectrum, can become an important part of achieving, I think, what you're asking for there. But if I contrast this to, let's say, if I had to pay for some kind of upfront capacity, but then perhaps I have more data loaded, or having to choose these sizes in terms of the capacity. And our view of Spectrum is that we want to allow you, with the right controls defined through query monitoring rules, to access all of your data and not have to prepay for it. But we understand some of the feedback, and we're happy to kind of take more considerations on future options. But again, Michael, and for anyone else on the call, if we don't get to your question, if you just want to reach out to me, gregkh@amazon.com, happy to address offline as well. All right, so I think that's all the questions. I think I'll give it another minute to see if any more questions pop in. Okay, yep, let's see. Okay, thanks, Michael. Again, we really intended this webinar just to kind of provide an overview of migration and what's possible, and how I can leverage tools like database migration service or schema conversion tool to move into Amazon Redshift. And we'll definitely want to follow up with more webinars in terms of deep dives and demonstrations that'll be coming out shortly. But otherwise, unless there's any other questions, we wanted to thank everyone for their time, and thank you for attending today's webinar.